The smell arrived before the trouble did. It slipped into the house quietly, the way problems often do, unnoticed at first, easy to ignore. At least that's what Daniel told himself as he stood in his kitchen one early morning, coffee cooling in his hand, nose wrinkled. It wasn't strong. Not yet. Just a strange, sour note hanging in the air, like something forgotten. He opened a window, blamed the old pipes, and went on with his day, never once wondering how much his life was about to change. If only he knew where the smell had come from, he might have walked away right then. Daniel lived alone in a narrow street where everyone knew each other's routines but rarely asked questions. He liked it that way. Quiet mornings, long workdays, and evenings spent watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The house had belonged to his uncle, and with it came creaking floors, thick walls, and a past no one ever talked about. The smell, he decided, was just another part of that past settling in. Old houses always had their secrets, didn't they? By the second day the smell returned, stronger this time. It clung to the hallway and followed him into the living room. Daniel searched for obvious causes. He took out the trash, scrubbed the sink, checked the fridge twice. Nothing. Everything looked clean, normal, almost too normal. Still, the air felt heavy, like it was carrying a message he couldn't quite understand. His phone buzzed with a message from his neighbor, Mrs. Klein, asking if he'd noticed anything odd lately. He stared at the screen longer than he should have before replying with a simple no. What bothered him most wasn't the smell itself but how it made him feel. Uneasy. Wash. As if the house was breathing differently when he wasn't looking. That night, sleep came in pieces. Every creak sounded louder. Every shadow seemed deeper. He dreamed of walking through his hallway, following the smell to a door he'd never opened before. When he woke up, his heart was racing and the smell was there again, faint but unmistakable. On the third day, Daniel decided to ask around. He met Mrs. Klein while checking the mail. She leaned closer than usual, her voice low. She said the street hadn't smelled right for a while now. She said things like this had happened years ago, back when people still remembered what this place used to be. Daniel laughed it off, but the words stayed with him. What had this place been before it became just another quiet street? That afternoon, while working from home, the smell suddenly grew sharper. It seemed to come from the far end of the house, near the storage room he rarely used. His uncle had always kept it locked, saying it was full of junk and memories better left alone. Daniel stood in front of the door, hand hovering over the handle. He told himself he was being silly. Smells had explanations. Everything did. Still, he walked away, choosing comfort over curiosity. Days passed and the smell refused to leave. It followed him outside, or maybe it was just stuck in his head. At the grocery store, he caught himself sniffing his clothes, embarrassed. At night, he replayed small moments from the past. His uncle's warnings. The way the neighbors avoided certain topics. The way this house had been offered to him so quickly, no questions asked. The smell felt less like a problem and more like a reminder, nudging him towards something he wasn't ready to face. Then the knocking started. Soft at first. 3 gentle taps, always late at night. When Daniel opened the door, no one was there. Just the smell, stronger than ever, drifting in from the darkness. He called a friend, joked about old houses and overactive imaginations, but his laughter sounded thin even to him. He stopped opening the door after that. He didn't need to. The smell always found its way inside. One evening the power went out. The house fell into silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling appliances. In the dark, the smell felt alive, curling through the rooms with purpose. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and, without fully understanding why, found himself standing in front of the storage room again. The lock looked older than he remembered, scratched and worn, like it had been forced before. His hands shook as he shined the light on it. This time he didn't walk away. As he reached for the handle, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It read, "You should have asked where it came from." His chest tightened. The smell was overwhelming now, filling his lungs, making his eyes water. He twisted the handle, half expecting it not to move. But it did. Slowly. Too easily. The door creaked open just enough for the smell to spill out, thick and undeniable. Daniel froze. Whatever lay beyond that door wasn't just a forgotten mess or a broken pipe. It was something tied to the house, to the street, maybe even to him. His flashlight flickered, threatening to go out at any second. Behind him, the knocking started again, louder this time, urgent, like a warning or a demand. Daniel stood there, caught between the dark room and the dark hallway, heart pounding, breath shallow. If only he knew where the smell had come from, he might have been prepared for what waited on the other side. But he didn't. And as the door opened wider, the truth he'd been avoiding finally began to surface, bringing with it a choice he could no longer escape. The door stopped halfway as if the house itself had decided that was far enough. Daniel stood frozen, fingers locked around the handle, listening to his own breathing echo in his ears. The smell pouring from the storage room was different now. Deeper. Older. Not just unpleasant, but heavy with something he couldn't name. Dust, damp wood, and a sharp edge that made his stomach turn. He didn't step inside. He couldn't. Instead, he pulled the door shut and leaned against it, heart pounding like he'd just run for his life. The knocking stopped the moment the door closed. The silence that followed felt louder than the noise ever had. Daniel slid down until he was sitting on the floor, the flashlight resting uselessly beside him. In that moment he realized something that made his chest tighten even more. The smell hadn't come from outside. It had always been inside the house, waiting. The next morning, daylight made everything feel slightly less threatening, but the unease never fully left. Daniel called in sick to work, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie. He walked through the house slowly, noticing details he'd ignored before. The faded marks on the walls. The way certain floorboards looked newer than others, like they'd been replaced in a hurry. Even the windows seemed thicker in some rooms, harder to see through, as if they were meant to keep things in as much as keep things out. He found an old box in the hallway closet while looking for cleaning supplies. Inside were photographs, letters, and documents tied with brittle string. Most of them belonged to his uncle. Daniel sat on the floor and began to sift through them, hands trembling just enough to make the paper rustle. The photos showed the house years ago, surrounded by people he didn't recognize. Faces smiling too stiffly, eyes avoiding the camera. On the back of one photo, a date was written, followed by a single word, before. Before what? The question lingered as Daniel unfolded one of the letters. It was short, written in hurried handwriting. It talked about complaints, about a smell that wouldn't go away, about neighbors asking questions. The last line was underlined so hard it nearly tore the page. Do not open the room. Daniel dropped the letter like it burned his fingers. His uncle had never been the superstitious type. He believed in fixing problems, not hiding from them. So why would he leave something like this behind? And why leave the house to Daniel without explaining any of it? That afternoon, Mrs. Klein knocked on his door. Daniel hesitated before opening it, half expecting the smell to rush out again. She looked relieved when she saw him, but her eyes flicked past his shoulder into the house. You look tired, she said. Not sleeping well? Daniel shrugged, trying to keep his voice steady. Old houses, he replied. They make noises. She nodded slowly as if she'd expected that answer. They also remember things, she said. Then, as quickly as she'd come, she left him standing there with the door half open and a chill creeping up his spine. That night, Daniel dreamed again. This time he wasn't alone. He stood in the storage room, the door wide open, the smell so strong it made his eyes water. Shapes moved in the darkness, not quite visible but close enough to feel. He woke up gasping, sheets tangled around him, the smell faint but present, like a reminder that the dream hadn't stayed in his head. Over the next few days, Daniel started noticing changes in the neighborhood. People avoided his house. Conversation stopped when he walked past. A delivery driver hesitated before approaching the door, wrinkling his nose and stepping back. Even the air outside felt different, heavier near his property. The smell was spreading, or maybe people were finally admitting it had always been there. Driven by a need for answers, Daniel visited the local library. He searched through old newspapers, scanning yellowed pages until his eyes ached. Buried in the back of one issue was a small article about a complaint filed on his street years ago. It mentioned disturbances, unexplained odors, and an investigation that ended abruptly. No details. No follow-up. Just a quiet disappearance of the story, like it had never mattered. The librarian watched him from behind the desk as he copied down notes. When he thanked her on his way out, she hesitated before speaking. Some stories don't end, she said softly. They just wait. Back at the house, Daniel stood in front of the storage room again. He didn't open it, but he placed his hand on the door, feeling the cool wood beneath his palm. The smell seeped through the cracks, steady and patient. It didn't feel angry. It felt expectant. Like it knew he was getting closer to the truth whether he wanted to or not. That evening, his phone buzzed again with a message from the same unknown number. This time it read, "He tried to warn you." Daniel typed back before he could stop himself, asking who they were talking about. The reply came almost instantly. The one who left you the house. Fear settled deep in his chest, heavy and unmoving. His uncle hadn't just left him a house. He'd left him a responsibility, maybe even a burden. The smell wasn't an accident or a simple problem to be fixed. It was a a signal that something unfinished was still trapped within those walls. As night fell, the knocking returned, louder than before, shaking the door in its frame. Daniel didn't move to answer it. He stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house, the smell curling through the air like a living thing. Somewhere beyond the walls, someone wanted him to open that door again. And deep down, Daniel knew that whatever was hidden there wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. The question wasn't whether he would face it. It was what would happen when he did. Daniel stopped sleeping altogether. Nights became long stretches of waiting, listening, and breathing through the smell that never fully went away. It shifted from room to room, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, as if it had its own rhythm. He began leaving lights on, not because it helped, but because darkness made the house feel too aware of him. Every sound carried meaning now. A pipe settling. A floorboard popping. The wind brushing the side of the house like fingers testing a lock. During the day he tried to act normal. He answered emails, reheated meals, and took short walks around the block. But the street no longer felt like a place he belonged. Curtains moved when he passed. Doors closed too quickly. Mrs. Klein watched him from her window, her face unreadable. When he raised a hand to wave, she didn't wave back. Instead, she turned away like she'd seen enough. Daniel began to wonder how long the neighbors had known. The thought stayed with him, growing heavier with each step back toward the house. Maybe the smell wasn't new to them. Maybe it was only new to him because he was the one living with it now. The idea made his skin crawl. This wasn't just his problem. It never had been. One afternoon, he noticed chalk markings near the edge of his property. Faint lines, almost washed away by time, drawn into the concrete. He crouched down, tracing them with his fingers. Symbols, maybe. Or just patterns made by someone bored long ago. Still, the smell seemed stronger there, like the ground itself was breathing it out. Daniel stood quickly, brushing off his hands, feeling foolish for even looking. Back inside, he found more of his uncle's things. A notebook tucked behind old tools in the garage. Most of it was filled with dates and short observations. Times when the smell was worse. Times when it faded. Notes about neighbors arguing. About complaints filed and then dropped. One entry stood out. They said it was handled. It wasn't. Handled by who? And what did that even mean? Daniel flipped to the last page. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. If he comes asking, tell him nothing. He's safer not knowing. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. His uncle hadn't been protecting the house. He'd been protecting him. That night, Daniel heard voices for the first time. Not clear words, just murmurs, drifting through the walls like a radio playing in another room. He followed the sound to the hallway, stopping outside the storage room. The door vibrated slightly, almost like something on the other side was pressing against it. The smell was thick enough to taste. Daniel backed away, his pulse racing. He wasn't ready. Whatever was in there knew that. His phone buzzed again. Another message. They lied to him too. Daniel didn't reply this time. He sat on the couch, staring at the dark screen, trying to remember the last honest conversation he'd had with his uncle. There hadn't been many. They talked about work, weather, small things. Never the house. Never the past. Maybe that was the point. The next day, Daniel ran into a man named Robert at the edge of the street. Robert had lived there longer than most, long enough to remember when the houses were newer and the street was louder. Robert looked older than Daniel remembered, his face lined with something more than age. When Daniel mentioned the smell, Robert went quiet. Too quiet. It's not polite to dig into things that were buried on purpose, Robert said finally. His eyes flicked toward Daniel's house. Some answers don't help. They just spread. Daniel wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. Spread. Like the smell. Robert walked away before Daniel could ask anything else, leaving behind a warning that felt heavier than any threat. As days passed, the house seemed to change. Doors creaked open on their own. The air felt damp even when it wasn't raining. Daniel started losing track of time, unsure how long he'd been standing or staring or listening. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps pacing above him even when he was upstairs. Sometimes he smelled it strongest when the house was completely silent, like it was waiting for him to notice. He tried to leave once. Packed a bag, keys in hand, heart pounding with relief at the thought of distance. But the moment he stepped outside, the smell followed. Not strong, not obvious, but there. Clinging. Patient. Daniel turned back, shoulders slumping. This wasn't something he could outrun. That evening, he found a folded note slipped under his door. No name. Just a sentence written in careful, deliberate ink. It started with something small. Daniel read it over and over. Something small. A mistake. A decision. A door opened when it shouldn't have been. He sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down, surrounded by his uncle's notes, old photos, and unanswered questions. The smell drifted through the room, steady and calm, like it was listening. Daniel realized then that the house wasn't the center of this story. It was just the container. Whatever had happened here had touched everyone on this street, binding them together in silence. Outside, the knocking began again, not at the front door this time, but along the walls. Slow. Measured. Like someone walking around the house, testing every surface. Daniel stayed where he was, hands clenched, breath shallow. He didn't know who was knocking or why. Only that they wanted him awake. Where? Somewhere between fear and exhaustion, Daniel understood one thing clearly. The smell wasn't a warning anymore. It was a reminder. And whatever truth it carried was getting closer, whether he was ready for it or not. The house no longer felt like a place Daniel lived in. It felt like a place he was being kept. Every room carried the smell now, not overpowering but constant, like a presence that refused to leave him alone. He started keeping track of it without realizing. Where it was strongest. When it faded. It always seemed to grow heavier just before something happened. A knock. A message. A sound that didn't belong. Daniel stopped answering his phone altogether. Friends had left worried voicemails, but he couldn't bring himself to explain something that already sounded impossible in his own head. How do you tell someone a house is watching you? That a smell feels like a warning? That silence can feel louder than shouting? It was easier to let the calls ring out and sit with the truth he was slowly uncovering. One night, he heard movement beneath the house. Not pipes. Not animals. Something slower. Intentional. He lay on the floor, ear pressed against the wood, heart racing. The smell rose sharply, almost burning his nose. Whatever was down there wasn't new. It had been there a long time, waiting just like everything else tied to this place. Daniel pulled himself up, hands shaking, and backed away as if the floor might give in beneath him. He returned to the storage room, standing inches from the door. He could feel it now, a pressure in his chest like the air was thicker there. His uncle's warning echoed in his mind. Do not open the room. But warnings only work when they come with reasons, and Daniel was running out of patience and sleep. The smell seemed to pulse as if responding to his thoughts. For a moment he swore he heard his name whispered through the door. Outside a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the windows, rain tapping against the roof like nervous fingers. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. Daniel didn't move. He stood there in the hallway, soaked in tension, knowing this night was different. Everything felt closer. Tighter. Like the house had drawn in a breath. A knock came from inside the walls, sharp and sudden. Daniel flinched. Then another. And another. Not random. A pattern. 3 knocks just like before. His phone buzzed on the floor behind him. He didn't want to look, but he did anyway. A single message lit up the screen. It can't stay hidden much longer. The smell surged, spreading fast, filling the hallway, crawling into his lungs. Daniel's eyes watered as he reached for the door handle. It was warm now. The wood felt alive beneath his palm. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stop, to leave, to pretend none of this was real. But deep down he knew leaving wouldn't end anything. It would only make it follow him. Suddenly the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Daniel turned slowly, scanning the hallway. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, bending toward the storage room. The smell settled into something almost calm, as if it was confident now. As if it knew he wasn't turning back. A sound came from the living room. A chair scraping lightly across the floor. Daniel's breath caught. He hadn't moved it. He stepped back, heart pounding, and watched as the chair shifted again just an inch, then stopped. The smell wrapped around him, thick and steady, grounding him in place. You wanted to know, a voice said softly. Daniel spun around, but no one was there. The words didn't echo. They didn't bounce off the walls. They felt close, like they'd been spoken right beside his ear. His legs trembled, but he stayed standing. Fear had burned through him so many times by now that something else was taking its place. A need. A pull toward the truth, no matter how heavy it was. He thought of his uncle then. Of the quiet way he'd lived. Of the way he'd avoided questions. Maybe he hadn't been weak. Maybe he'd been carrying something no one else would. The smell wasn't just a sign of something wrong. It was a reminder of something unresolved, something everyone on this street had agreed to forget. The storm outside grew louder, rain pounding hard against the house. Water began dripping somewhere down the hall, slow and steady. Drip, drip, drip. Each sound felt like a countdown. Daniel wiped his face, unsure if the wetness was sweat or tears. His hand tightened around the door handle. Another message buzzed onto his phone. Once you open it, there's no closing it again. Daniel let out a shaky breath. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The house already knew his answer. The smell thickened one last time, filling every corner of the space as if urging him forward. The walls creaked, the floor groaned, and somewhere beneath it all, that slow movement returned. Daniel pulled on the handle. The door resisted, just for a moment, like it was giving him one final chance to walk away. Then it began to open, inch by inch, releasing a wave of cold air and a smell so deep and familiar it made his head spin. His flashlight flickered wildly, barely holding on. Behind him, the front door slammed shut on its own. Daniel stood frozen between what he had avoided and what he could no longer escape, knowing that whatever waited beyond that door was about to change everything. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it swallowed the beam of Daniel's flashlight almost instantly. He could barely see, but the smell, stronger than ever, seemed to guide him forward. It wasn't just old wood and dust anymore. There was something else in the air, something metallic, sharp, alive. His stomach churned, but he took a cautious step inside. The floor beneath him groaned like it was warning him, but he ignored it, drawn deeper into the room. Then he saw it. A small table in the center, covered in papers and objects he didn't recognize. Candles long burned down to stubs. A book with pages darkened from age. And at the center, a photograph, one he knew too well. It was his uncle, smiling in the same hallway he now stood in, but the background was different. Behind him, faint shapes moved, shadows that didn't belong to any person. Shapes that seemed almost human but wrong. Daniel froze. The air thickened, pressing in around him. The smell grew sharp, stinging his nose, almost suffocating. A sudden noise behind him made him spin around. The door he had just opened slammed shut on its own, harder this time, rattling the walls. The flashlight flickered and went out, leaving him in near total darkness. Heart pounding, Daniel fumbled for his phone to use as a light. When he finally managed to turn it on, the beam landed on the photograph again, but something had changed. The shadows in the picture were gone, replaced by something else. Something moving. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked back, the photograph was empty. Just blank paper staring up at him. Before he could process what he was seeing, a cold breeze swept through the room. It didn't come from the window or the cracks in the walls. It came from the floor, curling around his legs, rising to his chest. The smell hit him full force, almost unbearable. But it wasn't just the smell anymore, it was a message. A warning he couldn't read but somehow understood. He had stumbled into something far larger than just the house. Then came the whispers. At first, faint, distant, almost like wind brushing through leaves. But as he strained to listen, they became words. His name. Repeated over and over. Daniel froze in place, unable to tell if the sound was real or his mind unraveling. The floorboard shifted beneath him, and for a moment he thought he saw something moving, something living, under the floor. Just a glimpse, gone as quickly as it appeared. His breath hitched, chest tightening. He hadn't expected this. Nothing in the notes, the messages, or the warnings had prepared him for what was happening now. Desperate for answers, Daniel approached the table. The book lay open as if waiting for him. He hesitated, then leaned closer. The pages were filled with names, dates, and symbols. Some he recognized from the notebook his uncle had left behind. Others, he had no idea. One symbol repeated over and over, dark and smudged, almost bleeding into the paper. And next to it, a single word written in bold, here. Before he could process it, a second door in the room, one he hadn't noticed before, creaked open slowly. Cold air poured from it, carrying the same sharp, metallic scent. The room beyond was darker than this one, and the smell was strongest there, almost magnetic, pulling him forward. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run. Every story, every warning, every message screamed at him to leave. But something deeper, something connected to his uncle, kept him rooted in place. Whatever was waiting behind that second door wasn't just a secret of the house. It was a secret of the family, something his uncle had hidden, maybe to protect him, maybe for another reason he couldn't yet understand. A sudden scrape echoed from the far wall. Daniel froze. Then another, closer this time. Whatever was in the house was moving, not randomly but deliberately. His flashlight flickered again, and he saw shadows stretching along the walls, stretching unnaturally toward the second door. The smell thickened, almost choking him, and for a moment, Daniel considered leaving everything behind, running until the street swallowed him whole. But then he remembered the messages, the warnings, the way his uncle had tried to prepare him. He realized that turning away wouldn't end this. It would only delay it. As he stepped toward the second door, the whispers grew louder, forming words he could almost understand. Not just his name this time, but sentences. "He knows," they said. "He shouldn't be here." The air was thick with anticipation, suffocating and electric. Every instinct told him he was crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. The smell, now nearly unbearable, wrapped around him like a living thing. And just as he reached for the doorknob, the floor beneath him groaned loudly, the lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to contract, pushing him toward the threshold. Then a voice, clear, unmistakable, almost human, called from the darkness beyond the door, "Daniel." He froze, hand on the knob, heart hammering. The voice was familiar. His uncle's. Or at least it sounded like him. But the tone, it wasn't comforting. It was warning him, but also demanding. Confusing. Terrifying. Daniel felt the weight of every decision he'd made over the past days pressing down on him. Every unanswered question, every message, every clue had led him here. And then the whispers surged together, louder, faster, almost drowning him. "Do not open. Do not see. Do not touch." The second door was just inches away. The smell was at its peak, so strong it burned his lungs. The shadows along the walls stretched farther, darker, moving toward him like smoke with a mind of its own. Daniel's hand trembled on the knob. He had no idea what would happen if he opened it, but a part of him knew he couldn't stop. The house had drawn him in too far. A final message buzzed across his phone. One he hadn't even heard come in. Just 3 words, "It's waiting there." Daniel swallowed hard. Every muscle in his body screamed to run. Every thought told him to stop. Yet the pull forward was irresistible. The smell. The shadows. The whispers. Everything inside the house, all the warnings, all the secrets, all the messages, it all converged on that door. And behind it, whatever was waiting wasn't going to remain hidden much longer. He reached for the knob. His hand shook violently, heart racing. The storm outside rattled the windows, the wind screaming through the trees, rain slashing against the walls. And in that instant, Daniel realized something terrifying. Whatever waited behind the door wasn't just tied to the house. It was tied to him. The house seemed to hold its breath. The smell swirled, thick and metallic, almost alive. Shadows pressed in from all sides. And Daniel, he was on the edge of stepping into something he could never walk away from. Daniel's hand trembled on the doorknob, every nerve in his body screaming to stop. The whispers had grown into a roar, crashing through the room like waves, and the smell, it was unbearable now, metallic and sharp, filling his lungs with each desperate breath. He forced himself to take one step, then another, heart hammering so loudly he thought the walls would shake. The second door groaned as it swung open, revealing a space that seemed impossibly deep, a room that shouldn't exist inside a house this old. Shadows twisted along the walls, pooling into forms he couldn't name. The smell surged toward him like it was alive, like it wanted him to see. And then he saw it. In the center of the room, surrounded by faint, flickering candlelight, was a chest. Not just any chest, but one carved with symbols he had seen in his uncle's notebook, the book on the table, even in the faint chalk markings outside. It pulsed, dark and heavy, as if holding a heartbeat of its own. Daniel stepped closer, each movement echoing in the vast, silent space. He hesitated, looking at the shadows stretching toward him, the smell swirling like smoke, almost beckoning him to open it. With a deep breath he lifted the lid. The smell hit him fully, sharp, pungent, but beneath it, something softer, warmer, almost human. Inside the chest were papers, photographs, and small items wrapped carefully in cloth. Daniel picked up the first photograph. His uncle, yes, but younger, standing in the same hallway he now lived in, smiling at someone else. Someone he recognized immediately. A man. A stranger, until he realized the stranger had the same eyes as him. Daniel's stomach dropped. The chest wasn't just holding family secrets, it held proof. Proof that the house had always belonged to the family, and that the smell, the whispers, the shadows, they were all tied to something passed down, not just a house but a responsibility. His uncle hadn't left him a house. He had left him a task. To protect, to remember, to keep what was contained within these walls from escaping. The whispers were warnings. The smell was a guide. The shadows, guardians of the same secret. Suddenly the chest shifted, almost breathing under his hands. Daniel dropped the photograph and stumbled back. The shadows leaned closer, stretching further into the room. They weren't malicious. Not exactly. But they were waiting. Expecting. They wanted him to understand, to accept the role he had inherited. A soft voice, unmistakably his uncle's, spoke from the shadows. "It's your turn now." Daniel froze. The whispers surged around him, echoing the same words in different tones, almost like a chant. "Your turn, your turn." The smell thickened, pulling at him, urging him forward. He understood then that the house hadn't been haunted in the usual way. It hadn't been cursed. It had been protected, guarded, waiting for the right person to inherit the secret. The realization hit him with dizzying force. He was the next guardian. The smell, the shadows, the messages, they had all been preparing him. But as he stepped closer to the chest again, ready to embrace the responsibility, the air shifted. Cold, sharp, unfamiliar. The shadows recoiled almost violently. And then he saw it. A second chest hidden behind the first, smaller, darker, and pulsing differently. Daniel's heart raced. He lifted the lid and inside, nothing human, nothing familial. Just a black liquid that shimmered like oil, moving on its own, alive. The whispers changed tone, urgent, panicked. The smell turned sour, almost rotten. The shadows screamed silently as if warning him. This was not meant to be seen. A single message appeared on his phone, even though it hadn't been connected. "He is still here." The truth slammed into him. The house had not only been a guardian of the family's legacy, it had been a prison. A trap for something else, something dangerous, something his uncle had contained long before Daniel was born. The smell, the shadows, the whispers, they were not only protectors. They were warnings. And now, with him here, the entity inside the second chest knew someone new had arrived. Someone it could manipulate. The shadows surged forward, encircling him, pulling the first chest closed as if shielding him from the second. Daniel's hands shook as he slammed the lid on the black liquid, sealing it with a force he didn't know he had. The smell lessened slightly, the whispers softened, but the warning remained clear. He wasn't just a guardian now. He was a prisoner too, bound to the house, bound to the secret. The storm outside raged, wind thrashing the windows, rain hammering the roof, but inside, Daniel stood still, chest heaving, mind racing. He understood the full scope now. The house was alive in its own way, protective, dangerous, demanding. It had chosen him. And the price of leaving was far greater than he could ever imagine. Then, in the silence that followed, his phone buzzed again. He hesitated, hand hovering over it. The screen lit up, not with a message but a live video. The camera faced the second chest. The black liquid was gone. Only a small handwritten note remained inside. "Not all that is contained can be trusted." Daniel dropped the phone. The shadows shifted around him, closer this time, pressing into him like cold walls. The smell lingered, sharp and metallic, reminding him that even though he had survived, even though he had inherited the secret, the house still held power over him. And now, a new fear settled in his chest. What if the entity in the second chest had found a way to reach beyond its container? What if the nightmare wasn't over, and the house had more in store than even his uncle had ever faced? Daniel stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, flashlight trembling in his hand. He was the guardian. He was the inheritor. But he was also trapped in a story that wasn't finished, bound to a house that watched, whispered, and waited. And somewhere, deep beneath the shadows, the final secret of the house stirred, ready for him to discover it. Daniel stood in the center of the room, the shadows pressing in like a living wall, the smell still lingering, sharp and metallic. His hands shook, and yet, for the first time in days, he felt a strange clarity. The house had tested him. It had pushed him to the edge of fear, of exhaustion, of understanding what it meant to inherit something far bigger than himself. And now, standing there, he realized that the fear wasn't the point. The point had been awareness, acceptance of what it truly meant to carry his family's legacy. He looked around at the two chests. The first, filled with memories, photographs, and small objects tied to his uncle, represented history, protection, guidance. The second, dark and shifting, had been a warning. Something dangerous, yes, but not meant to destroy him, not yet. Its power had been contained for a reason. His uncle had understood that some things could not be destroyed, only held in check. Daniel now understood that it was his responsibility. Not just to protect the house or the family's secrets, but to maintain the balance between what was kept safe and what could become a threat. The shadows began to recede slightly, the whispers softening to almost a murmur. The smell remained, but less aggressive, more like a reminder than a warning. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his chest loosen for the first time in days. He knew he wasn't free, not completely. He would never be the same. But he had survived, and in surviving he had earned his place as the guardian. He closed the first chest gently, placing it back in its spot in the center of the room. Then he turned to the second chest, hesitating for a long moment. The black liquid, or whatever had been inside, was gone now, leaving only that small note. Not all that is contained can be trusted. Daniel read the words carefully, letting them sink in. They weren't a threat. They were a reminder, a lesson his uncle had left for him. Some dangers cannot be solved by force. Some secrets cannot be exposed. They must be understood, respected, and managed. Daniel sat down on the floor, flashlight in hand, taking a long, deep breath. He allowed himself to feel exhaustion for the first time, acknowledging the mental and emotional toll of the past week. He thought about his uncle, about the quiet way he had lived, and realized that he had been preparing Daniel for this moment all along. The house had tested him because it knew he was capable. The smell, the whispers, the shadows, they had all been part of a system, a kind of awareness designed to teach, warn, and guide. Later that night, Daniel lit candles throughout the room, just as he had seen in the photograph of his uncle. The flickering light cast long shadows that no longer seemed threatening, but protective, almost familiar. The house, he realized, was not an enemy. It was a guardian itself, bound to the family and to the secret. And he was now a part of that system, part of something larger than himself. The next morning Daniel went outside. The street was quiet, the air crisp and clean after the storm. Mrs. Klein was on her porch, watching him carefully. This time, when he waved, she returned it, though her eyes carried a weight of understanding. He nodded slightly, acknowledging what he had learned without needing to explain it. Some things, he realized, didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were felt, known, and respected. Daniel spent the following days cataloging the objects in the first chest, making notes, reading the letters, photographs, and journals carefully. He made a small space for the second chest in the storage room, far enough from the rest of the house, yet close enough to keep an eye on it. Every action he took was deliberate, careful. He learned how to recognize the subtle signs, the way the smell shifted, how the shadows moved, how the whispers changed. He was learning the house, and in doing so, learning himself. As the weeks passed, life returned in small ways. Daniel started sleeping more, though the dreams of shadows and whispers lingered occasionally. He noticed the house creaking less, the air feeling lighter, almost relieved. The neighbors resumed their routines, offering cautious greetings, their wariness fading slightly. Daniel realized that part of his uncle's preparation had been to teach him patience, control, awareness. Fear had its place, but it couldn't rule him. One evening, as he sat by the window, cataloging a photograph of his uncle in the hallway, he reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the smell that had first drawn him into this story, the messages on his phone, the knocking, the whispers, the shadows. Every detail had been significant, every warning purposeful. He understood now that fear alone doesn't teach wisdom. Experience does. Responsibility does. And in embracing that responsibility, Daniel felt a strange peace. Not complete freedom, not ignorance, but balance. Then, just as he was closing the last journal, a small envelope fell from the ceiling beam above him. It had been tucked into the rafters, unnoticed until now. The handwriting was unmistakable, his uncle's. Daniel opened it carefully, hands still shaking from memory. Inside was a single sentence. "You are ready, but remember, some doors are never meant to be opened alone." Daniel smiled faintly, understanding the final lesson. The house, the smell, the shadows, they had been his teachers. He was no longer a passive occupant, a visitor caught in a strange and frightening story. He was the guardian, fully aware of the balance he must maintain. And while some doors might open in the future, he now knew the importance of preparation, patience, and respect. As he placed the note on the first chest, a gentle breeze swept through the room, carrying a familiar faint scent. Not unpleasant, not metallic, but clean and comforting. The house seemed to breathe, almost in approval. Daniel looked around the room, shadows stretching peacefully across the walls, the smell lingering softly, a constant reminder of the responsibility he now carried. He stood by the window one last time, looking out at the street. Life had resumed, ordinary and quiet, but he knew the house held more stories, more secrets, more tests. And he was ready for them. The fear that had gripped him was replaced by vigilance and understanding. The main conflict, the battle between ignorance and awareness, between fear and responsibility, was resolved. Daniel had learned the truth. Some mysteries must be managed, some dangers contained, and some legacies carried forward. But as he turned back to the room, he noticed a faint shadow at the edge of the far corner. It didn't move like before, didn't pulse like the first night. It was still, almost observing, as if waiting. Daniel paused, chest tightening for a moment. Then he smiled, steadying his breathing. The shadow, the smell, the whispers, they were not enemies. They were reminders. Part of the house, part of the legacy, part of him. Daniel sat back down, opened a new journal, and began recording everything he had learned. Every smell, every shadow, every whisper, every message, and every lesson from his uncle. He wrote with care, knowing that someday, this too might serve another person who would inherit the house, who would need guidance, and who would face the same tests he had. The house settled into quiet again. The smell remained, faint and steady, a guardian's presence rather than a warning. The shadows rested along the walls, protective and calm. Daniel finally allowed himself to rest, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly as he embraced the role he had inherited. He understood now that the house, the family, and the legacy were all connected. Fear had been the gateway, but understanding was the key. And somewhere, deep within the walls, the first chest and the second chest sat side by side. The past, the present, the hidden danger, and the guidance, everything balanced. The house had taught him its lessons, and Daniel had listened. He had faced the smell, the shadows, the whispers, and the secrets. And in doing so, he had become more than a resident. He had become the guardian, the keeper, the heir of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The storm outside had passed, leaving the street calm and bright under the morning sun. Daniel stood by the window, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the quiet settle around the house. The main conflicts were resolved, the lessons learned, the legacy secured. But the house, patient and enduring, remained alive, ready to guide the next generation when the time came. And Daniel, finally at peace, knew one truth above all. Some mysteries are not meant to terrify, but to teach. The house smelled faintly of wood, dust, and history, and Daniel smiled. He was home. And now truly he belonged.